"Tonight, pick your side of the bed," said the giant bride, but what he felt beneath the blanket changed everything. Witness this unbelievable true inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The Montana plains stretched endlessly beneath a sky brushed with pink and gold. The evening sun sank slowly behind the distant mountains, throwing long shadows across the Tanner ranch. The land looked beautiful, but beauty didn't make the loneliness hurt less. Luke Tanner, a man hardened by years of labor and loss, leaned on the wooden rail of his porch and listened to the wind whistling through the dry grass. It was a sound he had grown used to, a sound that filled the empty spaces left behind by the people who used to be there. It had been nearly 3 years since his wife, Annie, passed away. The winter she died had been brutal, snow piled higher than the fence posts, and the cold cut through even the thickest wool. Since that day, Luke had poured every drop of energy into his work. He woke before dawn, tended to the cattle, fixed broken fences, and came home to a silent house. But no matter how much he worked, he couldn't bury the ache in his chest. Every night ended the same way, with him staring at the ceiling, listening to the old clock tick, wishing for something to break the silence. A few months back, out of desperation and a touch of hope, Luke had written to a mail-order bride agency. He wasn't looking for beauty or charm, just companionship, someone who could share his long, quiet days. He'd almost forgotten about the letter until the reply came. A woman named Clara May is willing to travel to Montana. She's tall, strong, and unafraid of hard work. She's not the delicate type. That description made him laugh. Not delicate, good. He didn't need someone who would faint at the sight of mud. He needed someone real. Now, as the sound of hooves echoed down the dirt road, Luke straightened his coat and walked toward the gate. The carriage stopped in front of his ranch house, and a tall figure stepped down. His first thought was that she didn't look like any bride he'd ever seen. Clara May towered over the driver, her shadow long and sure in the fading light. She wore a plain gray dress, a traveling coat, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. When she looked up, her green eyes caught his, sharp, observant, and surprisingly gentle. Her auburn hair was braided tight, and her posture was proud, like she'd spent her life carrying her own burdens without complaint. "You must be Luke Tanner," she said, her voice steady, almost amused. "That'd be me," he replied, tipping his hat. "And you must be Clara." She nodded, smiling faintly. "I was expecting a man taller than the stories made you sound." That made him laugh, a deep and rusty sound that hadn't left his throat in a long while. "Well, the stories tend to stretch things out here. Come on in, ma'am. You've had a long ride." The cabin wasn't much, just 2 rooms, a fireplace, and a sturdy table made from reclaimed barn wood. But Clara seemed to like it. She took off her coat, revealing strong arms and a frame that looked built for labor, not leisure. Luke poured her a cup of coffee while she unpacked a few small things, a Bible, a locket, and a worn leather notebook. They ate a simple meal of stew and bread, and for the first time in years, Luke found himself talking more than he planned. She asked about his ranch, his cattle, and the land. He told her about the floods, the wolves, and the winters that could freeze a man's soul. She listened with quiet interest, nodding occasionally but saying little about herself. After dinner, she rose from the table, stretching her arms. "I suppose we'd best turn in," she said softly, glancing toward the small bedroom. Luke froze, unsure how to respond. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Then she smiled slightly, a smile that carried both kindness and boldness. "Tonight," she said gently, "pick your side of the bed." Her words hung in the air, warm and disarming. Luke hadn't shared a bed since Annie's passing, and the idea sent a nervous chill through him. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "You sure about that? The couch is—" "I didn't ride 5 days across the country to sleep on a couch," she interrupted, her tone playful but firm. "I'm not made of glass, Mr. Tanner." Luke nodded slowly, feeling a mix of respect and unease. "All right then. The bedroom was small, the bed large enough for two but clearly old. The quilt had been stitched by his late wife, and as he spread it over the mattress, memories tugged at his chest. He lay down stiffly on the right side while Clara took the left. The light from the fireplace flickered across the walls, painting the room in soft amber tones. For a while, neither spoke. He could hear her breathing, steady, calm, reassuring. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and the night wrapped around them like a quiet blanket. Then, without meaning to, his hand brushed against hers beneath the quilt. Her skin was warm, surprisingly warm, and calloused from work, just like his. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand slightly, her fingers resting against his. It wasn't romance. It wasn't desire. It was something deeper, two lonely souls recognizing each other in silence. For the first time in years, Luke felt safe enough to close his eyes. He woke before dawn, the dim light of morning creeping through the window. Clara was already up, stoking the fire, her hair loose around her shoulders. She glanced at him and smiled. "You snore," she said. He rubbed his neck, chuckling. "Been told that before." "Well, it's not too bad," she teased, "considering I've slept through worse." As the day began, they fell into an easy rhythm. Clara helped him with the cattle, lifting hay bales like they weighed nothing. She moved with surprising grace for someone her size, and her laughter, loud, unrestrained, echoed through the open land like music. Luke found himself watching her more often than he should have, his heart stirring in ways he thought it never would again. Over the next few days, the awkwardness faded. They shared stories over supper, hers filled with grit and resilience. She told him about losing her brother in the war, about working as a nurse and how she'd seen too many men broken by the world. Luke listened quietly, realizing that beneath her strength, she carried her own grief, heavy as his. One evening, after fixing a section of the fence, Luke came inside to find Clara sewing by the fire. The glow softened her sharp features, and for a moment, she looked almost fragile. He sat across from her, his voice low. "You don't talk much about yourself." She looked up, her eyes steady. "Talking doesn't change what's already done." He nodded slowly. "Guess that's true. But sometimes talking makes it hurt less." Clara smiled faintly. "Then maybe you should do more of it, Luke Tanner." That night, as they lay side by side again, the wind outside grew fierce. The windows shook, and thunder rolled across the valley. Luke felt her shift closer beneath the blanket. Her hand brushed his once more, and this time, she didn't stop there. She slid her hand across his arm, resting it gently on his chest. He didn't move. The warmth of her touch spread through him like a quiet fire, thawing something long frozen. He turned his head slightly, their eyes meeting in the dim light. "You're not afraid of much, are you?" he whispered. "Only of wasting what little time we're given," she replied softly. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that small cabin, something began to heal. When the thunder finally faded, and the night grew still, Luke felt her heartbeat through the quilt, strong, steady, alive. It was then he understood what had truly changed beneath that blanket. It wasn't the touch of another person. It was the return of something he thought he'd lost forever, the simple, unspoken comfort of being seen, understood, and no longer alone. As sleep pulled him under, he heard her whisper, just before dawn broke, "You chose the right side of the bed, Luke." And for the first time since Annie's death, he smiled, because this time, he believed it. The winter winds came early that year, whispering across the Montana plains and dusting the Tanner ranch with the first hint of snow. Luke Tanner stood on the porch, coat collar turned up, watching the white flakes gather on the railings. The land stretched endlessly before him, silent and silver under the morning sky. It had been months since Clara May arrived, and yet every morning he still woke up surprised to find her there, warm, steady, and real. Inside, Clara was by the fire, stirring a pot of stew while humming a tune Luke didn't recognize. Her voice, low and soothing, filled the cabin with a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. He lingered in the doorway, just watching her. She caught his reflection in the window and smiled without turning around. "You planning to stand there all morning, cowboy?" she said lightly, "or are you going to help me chop more wood before the storm hits?" Luke grinned. "You sure you want to risk me near that axe again? You said I swing like a drunk mule." Clara laughed, the sound echoing through the small cabin. "That's because you do. But you've got heart, I'll give you that." He walked closer, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. The smell of stew and firewood mixed with the faint scent of her hair, like pine and something warm. "I've got heart," he murmured against her ear, "because you gave me reason to find it again." She turned in his arms, her hands resting gently on his chest. Her eyes softened. "Luke Tanner, you always say things like that when you're trying to get out of work." He smiled, leaning his forehead against hers. "Can't blame a man for trying." Outside, the sky darkened as heavy snow clouds rolled in from the west. By noon, the storm arrived in full force. Wind howled through the gaps in the shutters, and snow began to pile high against the cabin walls. Luke secured the animals in the barn, his coat soaked through, while Clara kept the fire roaring and laid out blankets. When he returned, his cheeks were red and his hands stiff from the cold. "Good Lord," she said, rushing to meet him. "You're half frozen." He pulled off his gloves and boots, shaking the snow from his hat. "Cows are safe. That's what matters." Clara frowned, taking his hands in hers. "You matter too." Her words hung in the air like the glow of the fire, quiet, sincere, and impossible to ignore. She guided him toward the hearth, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and poured him a mug of hot tea. He sat there, watching her as the storm raged outside. She looked so sure, so capable, like the world could fall apart and she'd still find a way to hold it together. After a while, he spoke softly. "You ever think about leaving this place?" She looked up from the fire. "Why would I?" "Because it's rough out here. Lonely, even when you're not alone. You could have gone anywhere." Clara sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "I came here because I needed peace. I found it with you. That's not something I walk away from easily." He studied her face, the strong jaw, the faint scar near her temple, the small lines that told stories she'd never spoken aloud. "I reckon you've seen your fair share of storms." She nodded slowly. "Enough to know the calm doesn't last forever. But I also learned that some people are worth weathering the next one with." Luke reached for her hand beneath the blanket. Her fingers, warm and solid, intertwined with his. "Then I hope when the next storm comes, you'll still be right here." "I will be," she whispered. "As long as you'll have me." That night, the snow fell heavier than ever. The wind shrieked across the roof, rattling the cabin walls, but inside, everything was still. Luke and Clara sat by the fire, wrapped together under the same quilt that had once separated strangers. The flames danced, casting golden light across her face. "You ever think about Henry?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of the question. Clara's eyes flickered toward the fire. "Every day," she admitted. "But it doesn't hurt the same way it used to. For a long time, I thought remembering him meant I couldn't move on. But now I know it just means he mattered." Luke nodded slowly. "I know that feeling. I used to think loving someone new would be like betraying Annie. But maybe love isn't something you replace. Maybe it's something that grows when you make room for it." She looked at him then, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You talk like a poet when you're half asleep." He smiled faintly. "And you listen like someone who knows what it means." The storm howled, and she leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "Luke," she murmured, "if you hadn't written those letters, I'd still be wandering from place to place, pretending I was fine. You saved me from that." He turned his head slightly, his lips brushing her hair. "No, Clara, you saved me first." They stayed like that for hours, two people who had lost everything and somehow found enough strength to begin again. Days passed before the storm broke. The snow lay deep across the fields, glistening under the sun like powdered glass. Luke hitched the horses to the sled to haul hay to the barn while Clara shoveled a path from the porch. They worked wordlessly but with easy rhythm, their movements perfectly in sync. That evening, after the chores were done, Luke brought out an old wooden box from the attic. Clara looked up from her sewing as he set it down on the table. "What's that?" she asked. He opened it slowly, revealing a folded dress, a photograph, and a worn leather ring pouch. "Annie's things. I kept them all these years. Couldn't bring myself to look inside until now." Clara hesitated, unsure whether to speak. "Are you sure you want to show me?" He nodded. "I think it's time." He pulled out the photograph, a faded image of a young couple standing in front of the barn. "She was the gentlest soul I ever knew," he said quietly. "She loved this ranch more than anyone." Clara touched the edge of the picture gently. "She looks kind." "She was," he said, smiling faintly. "She'd have liked you." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. Her throat tightened, but she managed to whisper, "I hope so." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't have to fill her place, Clara. You've already made one of your own." She blinked away tears, squeezing his hand back. "Then maybe this is where I was meant to end up all along." That night, as they lay together, the moonlight spilling across the quilt, Luke couldn't sleep. He watched her, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath, the calm on her face even in sleep. He thought about how she'd walked into his life, tall and unshaken, and somehow managed to mend what he thought was beyond repair. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Beneath the blanket, his hand found hers. It was a simple touch, but it carried the weight of everything they'd both endured. The losses, the storms, the long years of loneliness. He finally whispered, "I love you, Clara May." The words slipped out so softly that he wasn't sure she'd heard them. But a moment later, her fingers tightened around his, and she murmured, half asleep, "I know, Luke Tanner. I know." The following morning, the snow began to melt under a gentle sun. Birds returned to the fields, and the air smelled of earth and thawing grass. Luke stood on the porch again, watching the horizon. Clara joined him, her arm brushing against his. "Spring's coming early," she said. "Looks that way," he replied. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Feels like a new start." He smiled, his voice low and steady. "That's because it is." She looked up at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, not just love, but peace. The kind that comes from finally finding home. And as the sunlight warmed their faces and the snow melted away, Luke Tanner realized something profound. Love doesn't always arrive soft and gentle. Sometimes, it comes in the shape of a storm, fierce, unexpected, and strong enough to sweep away everything you thought you knew about loneliness. The first night she'd said, "Pick your side of the bed," he'd thought it was just a simple gesture. But now he understood. It wasn't just about sharing space, it was about sharing life. Beneath that blanket, two broken souls had touched and found something that neither time nor loss could ever take away. And as they stood together on the porch of that small Montana cabin, watching the world awaken once more, Luke Tanner knew, what he'd felt beneath that blanket on that first night hadn't just changed everything. It had saved him.